Okay, it's 2 minutes after 1. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Michigan Historic Preservation Network October webinar. My name is Xiaohan Bao Smith. I'm the project manager of MHPN, and our topic today is a deep dive into the TCPs and National Register listed archaeological sites in Michigan. Before we get started, I would like to go over some Zoom items. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box as you think of them. All the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And if you have any technical difficulties, please also type them into the Q&A box. The chat box will be used to share links and resources discussed during the presentation. And both the Q&A and chat boxes are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see them, please wiggle your mouse. And please participate in the survey after the webinar concludes. If this is your first time attending our webinar, we are the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We advocate for Michigan's historic places to contribute to our economic vitality, sense of place, and connection to the past. We could not do the work we do without our members and volunteers. So if you're not a member yet, please consider joining us at www.mhpn.org. The webinar series is supported in part by an award from the Michigan Arts and Culture Council. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available in the next few days. You will receive an email when it is available. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you our speaker today, Dr. Sarah Surface Evans. Dr. Sarah Surface Evans is an archaeologist with nearly 30 years of experience in Midwest and Great Lakes regions. Sarah joined the Michigan State Historic Preservation Office as Senior Archaeologist in 2022, where she leads the SHPO's archaeology program. She specializes in community-based archaeological practice and investigates cultural landscapes through small material culture, geographic information science, and geophysical perspection. Her research has investigated a variety of topics, including expressions of health and well-being in the late 19th century, the structure of space as an expression of power in settler colonial landscapes, and the role of memory, nostalgia, and haunting in contested colonial histories. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Sarah. Sarah, please go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much. Let me take a moment to get this up for you. All right. Does everybody see the slides? Okay, great. So first, I just want to start by thanking you and saying I really appreciate the invitation to be a presenter for one of the MHPN webinars. This particular topic is something that's near and dear to my heart. And I also want to give a shout out to my colleague, Amy Kroll, who's one of our federal projects archaeologists here at SHPO, who also recommended this topic as something for this webinar. Unfortunately, she could not be here today. She is on a project visit elsewhere. So I'll be the one doing the presentation, but this is information that both her and I would like to share with you. So while I'm relatively new to the SHPO, I have nearly 30 years of experience, as Jahan said. And in my career, I've worked in the private sector as well as academic archaeology. And as a result of that work, I've had the opportunity to work on a number of different National Register listed sites, as well as assisting with the nomination of several sites. Today, I will be giving you a brief introduction to the State Historic Preservation Office. I will provide an overview of the National Register of Historic Places, or NRHP, or National Register for short. I will define and discuss what is meant by traditional cultural places or traditional cultural landscapes. And then if you'll oblige me, I'll get a little bit nerdy and share some data that I've extracted by looking at the site file here at the SHPO and talk about the archaeological properties that are listed on the National Register. Lastly, we'll consider some of the ways that we can improve the representation of archaeological sites, districts, and TCPs in the National Register. So the Michigan SHPO, along with all the states and territories in the United States, was established as part of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, as amended. This act did a lot of things, but most importantly for today's talk, it created the National Register of Historic Places, and it also created a process called Section 106, which requires federal agencies to assist in the assess the effects of their actions on historic properties. Under the provisions of the NHPA, SHPO's mission is to identify, document, evaluate, protect, and promote Michigan's past. This work is accomplished through several different program areas within the SHPO. We have the survey program to identify historic properties, and designation helps to recognize them. Incentive programs provide funding and resources for preservation. Section 106 and review and compliance work works with federal agencies and their grantees as well as stakeholders. And we also have archaeology, which in many ways cross-cuts a lot of these different programs. So the archaeology program provides a variety of resources and expertise, including maintaining the technical standards and conducting training for consultants, agencies, and researchers. We also maintain the state archaeological site file, and that includes all reports and documents related to sites that have been identified in the state of Michigan. Along with that is curating archaeological collections that are related to the site file and ensuring compliance with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. Supporting the nomination of archaeological sites to the National Register is another essential thing that we do in the archaeology program. And we also assist with conducting Section 106 review and compliance, as well as providing public outreach and education materials. So today, I'm just going to be focusing on one of these different responsibilities. We'll be talking about the National Register. So many of you on the line may already be very familiar with the National Register. Maybe you've already nominated sites yourself or worked at sites that are part of the National Register. And just for fun, if you're inclined, you could list a name of a property that you've nominated or would like to nominate in the comments or the questions area. And we could talk about some of those later. For those of you who maybe are not familiar with the National Register, it's a program to identify, evaluate, and protect historic and archaeological resources throughout the United States. There are currently over 1.4 million listed historic properties nationwide, and of those, Michigan has nearly 2,200 listed properties. These historic places were nominated by ordinary citizens, communities, heritage professionals, as well as state, local, and tribal governments. Eligibility for a listing on the National Register is determined by several different factors. One is age. A site has to be at least 50 years old. Integrity. In other words, does it retain the important and defining traits that make this place significant? And significance, which I'll define and talk about a little bit more in a moment. National Register properties include buildings, structures, objects, sites, districts, and landscapes. And I'll give you some examples of those in a moment as well. So why is listing on the National Register important? There are a multitude of reasons why it might be useful to do this. One is that it really creates a national database of historic properties or historic places to provide information about our national, state, and local history. Second is that it encourages preservation of historic resources by documenting the properties that are significant to our communities. Three, it allows the impacts of the properties to be considered during Section 106 review process. And the fourth is that it provides opportunities for preservation incentives, such as grants and tax incentives. The question I often get is whether or not listing a property on the National Register affects property rights. And there really are no obligations for property owners on listed properties. There's no restrictions on their use, treatment, transfer, or disposition of private property. And the National Register does not lead to the public acquisition of property as well. It also doesn't automatically invoke any local historic districts, zoning, or local landmark designation. So the significance that I mentioned earlier, there's 4 different criteria of significance that we tend to look for to nominate a site or nominate a property to the National Register. And only the property only has to have one of these criteria, but in many cases they can have multiple criteria for the nomination. So broadly speaking, they break down as A, B, C, and D. A is the association with events or patterns in history. B is a relationship to the life or lives of important persons. C is that the property embodies distinctive characteristics of a period, method, or master. And D is often referred to as data, that the property has the potential to yield or continue to yield important information about the past. So if we look at the pictures here that I've provided for you, the first is the 40 Mile Point Lighthouse. This one is on the National Register and eligible under Criterion A, a broad pattern in history, as a property that represents Great Lakes maritime navigational history. The second photo is the Alden B. Dow home and studio in Midland. This site is eligible under both B and C because of its connection with Alden Dow, as well as being an important example of his design as an architect. The third photo is the Knapp's department store in Lansing, and a building I get to walk by on a very regular basis. I live right here in Lansing and work just down the street from it. And this is significant on criteria C as a distinctive, streamlined, and mid-century style building. And the last photo is actually an archaeological site. This is the Minong Mine on Isle Royal. This is an archaeological district that has evidence of both ancient and 19th century mining activities. Archaeological sites are often nominated under Criterion D because they have the possibility of producing additional information, but they can also be nominated under the other criteria as well. So as I mentioned earlier, there are buildings, structures, and sites. Here shown is the Guardian Building, the Ada Covered Bridge, and the Gainey Archaeological Site as some examples. National Register nominated properties can also be districts, and they can be, districts can be all sorts of things. Everything from the downtown district of a town. This is Mount Pleasant Downtown District, a great place to go get a wonderful sandwich and find a book to read. Or it could be the Maumee Bay Archaeological District, which is a landscape that encompasses roughly 20 archaeological sites within this unique geographic area. So changing gears a little bit here. Next, I want to consider and talk about landscapes and how those relate to traditional cultural places and traditional cultural landscapes. So the National Register can include landscapes, and these are a broadly construed idea that encompasses both the human and the natural environment, as well as the associated cultural and historical values and ideals that are related to this landscape or this place. Landscapes are usually conceived of as large-scale, culturally significant spaces. So it's not just the place itself, but also how it's viewed and conceived of by a community. The definition of a landscape recognizes that there's both social and historical connections to these places. Oftentimes, geographers, archaeologists, and anthropologists use the concept of landscape as a useful way to conceive of how societies use, configure, and conceive of their environment as complex spaces. Traditional cultural places and landscapes fit within this kind of concept or rubric. A TCP, or traditional cultural place, is a place of traditional religious and cultural significance that serves as a focal point for maintaining cultural identity and heritage of a particular community. On a broader scale or larger scale, a TCL, or traditional cultural landscape, may be comprised of a constellation of places, sites, and objects, both natural and cultural, that define and maintain a community's sense of identity. Both TCLs and TCPs can be defined with a variety of different information. So when we're thinking about defining these places and understanding them, we can use archival documents, oral histories, and archaeological data as various sources of information to characterize the history and the sense of place that goes along with these locations. A great resource to look into is the National Park Service Bulletin 38. This is the bulletin that describes what TCPs are and how to nominate them. This bulletin is currently undergoing revisions, and the SHPO reviewed and provided feedback to the National Park Service about Bulletin 38 earlier this year. The revised bulletin has not come out yet, but I imagine it will be available soon, and it provides a wealth of information. So to consider a couple of examples of Bulletin 38, a location where religious practitioners have historically gone and are known to go today to perform ceremonial activities in accordance with traditional cultural rules or practice is one example that Bulletin 38 discusses. And the photo I have here, the first one, is of Bears Ears. This is a traditional cultural place under this definition. Another example could be, for example, an Amish community, a rural community whose organization, buildings, and structures or patterns of land use reflect the cultural traditions valued by its long-term residents. And a third example shown here is Chinatown in San Francisco. And this is an urban neighborhood that has a traditional home of a particular cultural group that reflects its beliefs and practices. Something to note here is that TCPs may have archaeological components or archaeological sites, but they don't necessarily have to. So one of the things that I hope that you can sort of take away with you today, if you remember anything, remember that there are two really fundamental important characteristics of a TCP or TCL. These are unique places that are imbued with cultural significance and history. For example, they could be a place that is associated with the origin story of a particular culture or community. These are also places that have ongoing cultural practice and identity maintenance. For example, this could be a place where communities routinely go to harvest particular plants or particular materials. The bottom line is that a TCP must have both a historic component as well as still be relevant to a present day group of people. This last issue, that being relevant and utilized by a present day group of people, in some cases can be a little tricky for those of us who are heritage professionals, because we have to recognize that not all communities may still have access to their TCPs. They may have been displaced from their original lands or territories and may no longer have access to these places. So it's important for us to ensure that we are including all relevant communities and identifying cultural resources and using the appropriate stakeholders. So TCLs and TCPs may be comprised of numerous contributing sites, objects, buildings, structures, or districts. One of the questions that you may have is, why should I nominate or seek to nominate a TCP or TCL? There are both benefits and risks involved in nominating a TCL or TCP. Some of the benefits include providing additional resources, such as grant funding that could be used for the preservation of the property. Another is that it provides more awareness of the place so that it can be considered in the situation of National Environmental Policy Act or NEPA, environmental impact statements, as well as Section 106 consultation. On the other hand, there are risks that can be intrinsic to identifying TCPs and TCLs. Oftentimes, these are culturally sensitive places that have special knowledge that may not be appropriate to share with everybody. Sometimes this information is sensitive, and the communities that value these places may not want to share it regularly with the public. And one of the aspects of the National Register is that all of the documents that are created for nominating sites are generally public. So there has to be special considerations taken to protect that information and make sure that there isn't information released that the communities view as sacred or sensitive. So in doing work on TCPs, communities need to be carefully consulted, and the narratives of traditional cultural property nominations should be carefully crafted to make sure that you don't share information that's beyond what's necessary to make a case for significance. Ultimately, I would say that the decision to list a TCP or TCL should be left up to the community that views this place as significant. Um, in some cases, communities have felt that establishing a TCP as eligible for listing is enough to provide protections under Section 106 or the National Environmental Policy Act. So one of the things that the SHPO has been working on, and I've been part of in the last year or so, is seeking to find ways to make it easier for communities to nominate or to document TCPs and TCLs. So the first step, regardless of whether or not a TCP is nominated, is to document this place and to provide at least some minimum level of protections under Section 106. Because TCPs are more complicated and often involve a variety of different kinds of resources, we cannot use our typical above ground or archaeological forms to document these places. And so we've sought to develop a specialized form to document TCPs and recognize these places. SHPO staff, including myself, Katie Kolakithis, and Diane Toonstra, have researched forms used by other states as well as federal agencies in documenting TCPs. And we have worked to put together the best of these different documents to develop a draft form. So far, we have begun to share the draft form with various stakeholders. And it is our intent to hopefully make this available sometime in the next few months to next year or so. And if you have an interest in learning more about this and providing feedback about the TCP form, I welcome you to contact me, and I am happy to share the draft form with you. So switching gears for a moment. Now I'm going to dive into some of that information, the data that I mentioned earlier about National Register sites here in Michigan. So Michigan Archaeology, just as a reminder, I'm sure most everyone on this webinar is aware, but archaeology, even though it has a lot of parallels with paleontology, is not the same. Archaeologists are interested in people and living cultures and studying them through the material remains that are left behind, including artifacts and features that are left in the ground. We do not just study dinosaurs. And while most people think archaeology only happens in faraway places, Michigan has an incredibly diverse and interesting archaeological record that boasts over 25,000 terrestrial archaeological sites and 1,500 underwater archaeological sites. The history of Michigan archaeology spans at least 14,000 years, from Ice Age hunter-gatherers to 20th century colonization and industrialization and everything in between. On average, here at SHPO, we have at least 200 to 300 new archaeological sites documented every year and reported to our office. So this is not only a tremendous database, but it's a growing database, and it's always getting bigger and better every year. So this is the good news. The bad news is, if we start to look at those 25,000 archaeological sites, a very small percentage, only 0.7%, less than 1% of them are listed on the National Register. And if we look at the 2,200 sites that are listed on the National Register, only 9% of them are archaeological sites. So archaeological sites are very underrepresented. Why is this a problem? Well, it is a problem because the National Register is one of our mechanisms for identifying significant sites. Having this information available for the work we do in review and compliance under Section 106, and a whole segment of our collective history could be missing and could be in danger of not being considered. If we look more directly at the few archaeological sites that are listed as National Register properties, the total number is 186. Roughly 94% of them are designated as sites. And the map I have here shows the distribution of these listed archaeological sites within Michigan. We can see some good things. One is the places that have been heavily surveyed are areas that we know there's a lot of development. So for example, down in southeastern Michigan, around major cities, and also in rural spaces in the northern Michigan where there are national forests, and the national forests and federal land managers have conducted a lot of survey work. On the other hand, there are also areas that we can see are pretty barren of National Register listed sites, and that includes South Central Michigan, Lower Michigan, and North Central Lower Michigan. So these are areas that don't have a lot of sites represented. If we look at that 5% of sites that are listed, or districts, excuse me, that are listed on the National Register, this is only 9 archaeological districts for the entire state. These districts that are listed are in very significant places. If you look at their distribution on the map, for example, there's a cluster in Midland County, there's a cluster in the Straits, there's a cluster down in Monroe County. But there are certainly other areas where there are concentrations of archaeological sites that could be nominated as districts. And lastly, if you look at TCPs, the news is even bleaker. We only have 2 listed TCPs. However, the good news is that there are 10 eligible TCPs that have archaeological components in 7 different counties. So most of the TCPs in Michigan that are recognized have not been listed, only determined eligible. And that may be because of the sensitivity issues I mentioned earlier. But it also could be a lack of resources to seek nomination for these important places. So if we take a look at, I'm going to go back to sites. These are the archaeological sites that are listed on the National Register. If we break them down by age group and Broadly speaking, archaeologists tend to think of things as pre-contact, before Europeans came to the New World, and post-contact, after Europeans came to the New World. So if we break these down, we can see that about 45% of the sites are pre-contact in age that are listed on the National Register. About a third are post-contact in age, and about a quarter are a combination of both pre and post-contact. If we dive a little bit deeper into the different time periods of pre-contact archaeological sites that are represented, again, archaeologists tend to think about things as different time periods or eras. These eras are defined based on archaeological information and may not actually match time periods that indigenous communities recognize. But as they are defined through material culture, archaeologists recognize the Paleo-Indian period, which is the earliest Ice Age hunters and gatherers, the Archaic period, which is kind of a formation or foundation period in which communities were growing larger, spreading throughout the state, over time becoming more settled. The Woodland period, which is a period in which pottery and bows and arrows were invented and used, as well as more intensive agriculture. And these communities were living in more permanent settlements and engaging in long distance trade. As well as the Mississippian period, which is the very tail end of the pre-contact period. So of these pre-contact periods, the largest number of archaeological sites are from the Woodland period, and that's the 64% there you see in pink. This makes a lot of sense because from what we know about woodland peoples is that they lived in larger villages, larger settlements for longer periods of time. And what that means archaeologically is they left behind a lot more materials. They left behind a strong signature of things for us to find, like this large broken pot here. Woodland peoples were also mound builders and known to construct earthworks, and left behind these large spaces on the landscape, which are easy to find and recognize and identify. So it makes sense that there is such a large proportion of woodland sites that are listed on the National Register. But we can also see that there's a lot of room for nomination of Paleo-Indian period, which are the gray and orange sites, as well as the Archaic period sites, which are the purple here on the graph. For the post-contact, archaeologists tend to divide these different periods by the centuries, somewhat arbitrarily. But we can see here that the 19th century, which is the 37% here, is the largest time period represented in National Register listed sites. Again, this kind of makes sense because this is when the American settler colonialism really boomed and Michigan became a state. It's also when we see the greatest expansion of industrial development and extraction of resources throughout the state. So there are quite a lot of 19th century sites. That said, there are a fair number of post-contact sites from the 18th and 17th century, as well as the 20th century, but there's always room for improvement. And we could certainly see a lot more post-contact sites added to the National Register. And as I mentioned before, many post-contact sites may also have an above-ground component. So for example, the photo here is of the 40 Mile Point Lighthouse in Presque County. This is a lighthouse that was nominated to the National Register based on that maritime history and significance, but based on archaeology that I conducted there, we know that this is also a site that's significant based on its archaeological potential as well. So that will lead to part of my discussion on ways that we can help to improve the representation of archaeological sites. So what can we do? There are a few different strategies that I think are possible. And this is where the little added text to my title page, a call to action comes in play. This is the action that you all as attendees to this webinar can do yourself or share with others so that we can improve the number of National Register archaeological sites. The low-hanging fruit, if you will, the things that I think are the easiest for us to pursue is to include archaeology in our future above ground nominations. So for properties that are ostensibly mainly above ground resources, so these are buildings or structures that are significant under criterion A, B, or C, these are the places that may also have archaeological components. A great example here is the Malcolm X house in Inkster. This recent project involved both archaeologists and historians working together with community members to understand that this place is significant based on both its archaeology as well as the history of Malcolm X living in this house with his brother Wilfred Little for a period of time when it was very formative in his particular history, life history. So it's possible for us to, in the future, think about ways to incorporate more archaeology in the nomination of post-contact sites that include archaeology. Another idea is to revise old nominations. Many of the sites that have been nominated to the National Register in Michigan were done so many, unfortunately, decades ago, 30, 40 years or more. There was a real boom of nominations right after the National Register was, or the National Historic Preservation Act was passed. And many of these properties were listed only under those first three criterion, A, B, and C. They did not necessarily consider archaeological resources. An example here is the second picture, the upper picture in my slide. This is Packard Proving Grounds. I've been working with the community and board members who are interested in the archaeology of the grounds to understand the archaeological significance of this property. So even though it was nominated for other criteria, we now recognize that it also is eligible for listing under criterion D. The revision of an existing nomination is not as difficult as a full nomination. And so it's possible for communities who are working on these properties and recognize that through their management work that there are archaeological components to issue a revised nomination and to increase that number of archaeological sites. The third option in our low-hanging fruit is that I'm happy to report that there are 706 archaeological sites in SHPO records that have already been evaluated as eligible for National Register listing. These typically are sites that have had more excavation conducted at them, that they've had work beyond just a typical phase one or a survey. So they've had some evaluation done to determine that they are eligible for the National Register. And the reason why I call this the low-hanging fruit is if you are maybe a student or a community member or a heritage professional that would like to see more properties listed, these are a logical group of sites that you can pull up and go to and single out as ones that a nomination could be developed for, and they could be easily added to the National Register. So again, I'll say if you have an interest in doing some of that work, maybe working with the communities that these sites are situated in, let me know, reach out to me, and I can give you some information about where these sites are, and we can work together to see more of these sites nominated. So a little bit harder to do, and I think is really the sort of long-term struggle that many of us in heritage management face, is how to evaluate and nominate more sites under Section 106 compliance work that we do. Unfortunately, because of the timelines and economic pressures involved in the in Section 106, usually just determining whether or not a site is eligible is enough. And the extra step to go about nominating a site is just not possible because of the extra work and time it takes. So this is something that, you know, we all have to think about ways and strategies that we can do perhaps in the long term. But in the short term, there are those first three options to pursue and increase the number of archaeological sites in the National Register. So how can we also develop strategies for listing more districts in TCPs? As we saw, there are very few. We have 9 districts and 2 listed TCPs in Michigan out of thousands, tens of thousands of sites have been identified by archaeologists over the last 100 years or more. So a couple of strategies, and this is mainly, I'm targeting heritage professionals that might be on the line here, is to think beyond the site. Think about the landscape scale, the larger scale of the work you're doing. And if you repeatedly work in the same part of the state or in the same county, or maybe even in the same township, start to evaluate and think about how clusters of archaeological sites are related to each other and how they may be related to the landscape. This may also involve reanalyzing and reevaluating existing site data that we have in our database. And while right now we do not have this available through GIS, our new database system and our GIS system, which we all hope will be online in the next year or so, will make reanalyzing this kind of information a lot easier and more capable to be done in the future. Another thing that I strongly encourage is that as heritage professionals, again, we oftentimes work in the same areas repeatedly and maybe even with the same communities and stakeholders on a regular basis. So I strongly encourage that you think about developing long-term relationships with communities, establishing the trust and the relationships that are necessary to think about places and landscapes in that cultural framework or that cultural sense of a TCP or TCL. And that requires that sort of long-term commitment and trust that comes from working with communities over a long period of time. So to wrap this up, I hope that my presentation today has helped create some awareness of what TCPs and TCLs are as a type of historic property, and to start to recognize this as a framework for us to think about when evaluating cultural resources, especially on a broad scale across the landscape. I hope that I've shown you where there are some gaps in data that we have right now in our National Register listings, and that I've provided some potential solutions for us to start thinking about how to better represent archaeological sites in the National Register. So again, I would like to thank MHPN for the invitation to present, and also for you attending today, for being here and sharing this with me. I've also prepared a list of some resources, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me after this webinar as well as during the webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your time to put this together and sharing your knowledge with us. And we do have some questions in our Q&A box. I will just read them to you and you can go ahead and answer them. Okay, first question. Do you feel there are advocates for archaeology in the state legislature? For example, on the Cultural Caucus, we recognize that as a state employee, you cannot be active legislatively.
I will beg ignorance on this particular issue. I actually don't engage in any lobbying, so I don't actually know a lot about who out there the Michigan legislature is more supportive of this. Most of my outreach work is engaged with community members and on that sort of level, but I don't know. Sorry, I can't provide any answers there.
Okay, next question. There are a lot of sites found and documented during federally funded activities, but that work is not required to be moved on to the National Register listing. Have we ever been close to having this next important step to be part of the Section 106 requirements?
Yeah, it has not been considered a requirement. It usually is not. Typically, 106 projects move very, very quickly. And, once the determination is made, the reports are turned in, and everything's been signed off, we don't tend to require that extra step. And because of the cost and time involved in nominating properties to the National Register, most CRM firms are not going to be pursuing this on their own. But that is something that would be interesting to see if this is possible. I'm not aware of any states that make this a requirement. Um, I am aware of, I should back up. I'm aware of this being a requirement for example, mitigation level projects or MOAs that have been signed for projects where, as part of the addressing the adverse effects, that the property is nominated to the National Register. But I think that happens very rarely. Yeah,
Okay.
hope that answers your question.
Okay, next question. It's great to be seeing more archaeological programming at the annual statewide historic preservation conference. What do you and the SHPO have planned for the Kalamazoo conference in May?
Yeah, so we are actually organizing two different sessions. One session, which we hope will be unveiling our new state standards, at least where they are at that point for archaeology. And the second session will be talking about collaborative archaeology and showcasing several different examples from different parts of the state and different communities across the state that have done community-based and collaborative archaeology.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah, we're excited.
Okay, next question. Are TCPs recorded as a separate layer on GIS?
Good question. I think they will be, yes. And that's partly because of the sensitivity issues. This is a conversation we've been having internally and also with some other stakeholders. We will be mapping those locations, but they may be somewhat restricted depending on the wishes of the communities that are nominating these and recording these sites.
Hey. Okay, next question. The archaeology staff at the State Historic Preservation Office has had some new staff and members added. What have you been able to do that couldn't be done before?
Um, well, I came on in January of 2022, the same time as my colleague Amy Kroll. At that time, the only archaeologist on staff was Michael Humbacher. He has retired as of the end of the 2023 fiscal year. So we lost him effectively at the beginning of October. And right now we are in the process of hiring his replacement. So we'll be back up to 3 staff members once we have his replacement. We've been able to do a fair amount with having 3 of us. One of the things that I've tried to focus on as the senior archaeologist and the director of the program is to find ways for us to identify different stakeholders that we can work with on a regular basis. We are trying to collaborate with different community organizations and universities where appropriate to do some additional work. That has been one thing that has been very useful. That said, I think we could always have more staff, more archaeological staff, at the same time that we have more people in our office, more archaeologists in our office. We're also seeing just an incredible increase in the number of Section 106 projects. We had almost 4,000 projects reviewed in this past fiscal year, so it has been very, very busy. And we also were involved in the long-term consultation on several major NEPA and 106 projects. So those things eat up a lot of our time and trying to find a way to balance all of the various things. Yeah.
Great. Next question. How is a database coming along?
So I can talk a little bit about that. I'm not the point person on this. This is Diane Toonstra's baby, and she has been doing an immense amount of work. So the database is actually 3 different projects in one, which is one of the things I think most people don't recognize or realize. So the first is that we need a whole new database or indexing database for all of the site and project information. That's because the current SHPO system does not play nice with GIS. So we are first migrating to another system. The second issue is that we have all of those hundreds of thousands of technical reports, documents, site forms, all of the different files that have been produced over the last 50 or so years by our office are still paper-based. And so the second part of this project is imaging or scanning all of those different files and having those indexed and available through the new database. Okay, so we have currently on staff, there are 4 contractors who are doing data entry ahead of sending off all of those files. We box them up and every few weeks we box up a big batch of them, and they go out to our vendor to be scanned. So that project is happening, it's ongoing right now, along with the new database build. And then the third part of that is the GIS part. And that is the actual geospatial information for not only the sites for above ground in archaeology, but also survey areas and things like TCPs and districts and all the other different kinds of layers. So those have been mostly digitized, and except for any sites that have been reported since the archaeology quad maps were scanned in 2019. So there's kind of this backlog of sites that need to be added. We also have the backlog of survey areas. So all the surveys that happened since late 2019 have to be digitized. And we don't currently have any GIS support staff. That's something that we're working towards getting so that we have enough people to work on that project. So all 3 of those pieces are happening simultaneously and keeping us quite busy.
Okay. Next question. Do you see application of the state investment tax credit benefit being applied to any archaeological sites?
That's a good question. It would be wonderful if we could do something like that. I don't know enough about the state tax credit to be able to tell you for sure, but whoever is asking the question, if you want to reach out to me and we can chat to talk about that, I would love to hear more.
Great. Okay, next question. The State Historic Preservation Review Board has increased the amount of attention it pays to archaeological resources when reviewing National Register eligible above ground properties. Do you see that continue to advance?
Yeah, so I hope so. So again, to give credit and to all those who are due, I've been working with Todd in our office, our National Register Coordinator, and we have a process now so that as properties are coming up before the review board, they will be also reviewed by archaeologists on staff. So that way we can provide any feedback or comments about those properties and hopefully get folks thinking about ways in which they can, which was one of my suggestions earlier, ways that we can think about nominating sites that have above ground resources, also to include archaeological resources as well.
Next question. Do you place protective easements on archaeological sites?
Yeah, so this is a topic that has come up a number of times in the last year and something that we're working on. Um, there, to my knowledge, there's only a handful of sites that have archaeological easements. But I've had a number of different stakeholders reach out to me with the interest in developing easements for archaeological sites on their land. And I think we'll be providing some guidance documents on this topic, hopefully maybe by the end of the year or early 2024. Yes, I think that's very important.
Okay, next question. How does Michigan's archaeological program compare to those of other states? Meaning, are there other states that invest more?
Oh, that's a tough question. Yes, I mean, every state does it slightly differently. I think, one of the flagship, if you will, states for the Great Lakes region in terms of doing archaeology well is Wisconsin. Wisconsin has a very robust underwater archaeology program. They have a number of archaeologists who are doing Section 106 work, and they also have archaeologists doing a lot of public outreach activities and events and education. So, but they also have a staff that's much larger than ours. So it would be wonderful if we were able to do more, but I think we're doing fairly well here in Michigan with what we have at the moment. Again, as I said earlier, we can't advocate necessarily or lobby for ourselves, but that doesn't stop you all from lobbying on our behalf at SHPO.
Okay. Okay, there's a comment said the new TCP bulletin is scheduled for releasing in this calendar year.
Yes, that's what they've said. They originally, I heard that it was supposed to be out at the beginning of or at the end of the fiscal year, the 2023 fiscal year. That hasn't happened yet, but it should hopefully be out soon, very soon. Every time I do a search for Bulletin 38 on the web, I hope to see the new one pop up, but it's still the old one.
Okay. So the next question is would it be possible to see and get a summary of SHPO's comments on that?
Um, possibly, if they want to reach out to me, send me an email. I'll have to talk to my leadership on that just to make sure, but I don't see why that would be a problem.
Okay. Next. Okay. The addition of archaeological work done in tandem with work done on above ground resources. For example, the Malcolm X house may be a way to get more people involved. The public may be better be able to relate to historic archaeological artifacts like a bottle or shoe than a prehistoric archaeological artifacts. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's as in my bio, a lot of the work that I have done in the last decade has been collaborative, community-based archaeology. I'm a true believer of doing archaeology with and for the public and involving them. I think that people identify with any small object from the past, whether it's recent, 20th century or ancient, 3,000 years old. I think there's this amazing kind of connection that people can imagine in their minds with the past when they see the physical, tangible evidence of the past in that way. So I think there's utility of doing public archaeology for any period, but certainly for historic period archaeology, you know, there's a closer connection because we can see ourselves using, touching, doing things with the objects that are found at these sites that are, you know, 19th or 20th century sites.
Mm, okay. Oh, the last question. So what does the National Register of Historic Places program use the term for? Is that traditional cultural landscape, or is that something else they use?
So it would be a landscape. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I think that we have answered all the questions, and thank you again, Sarah, for your time. And our
Thank
next
you.
webinar is yet to be announced. Please follow our Facebook or our website. And this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available again in the next few days, and please check your email. And hope to see you all next time. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.